Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. My name is Salvatore Scibona. I'm the Sue Ann and John Weinberg Director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, where you find yourselves right now. Tonight, we help launch the new novel by Booker Prize finalist Madeleine Thien, The Book of Records, which she worked on during her 2021-2022 fellowship here at the Cullman Center. Early reviews of the novel have been ecstatic. The New York Times writes, "This staggering novel blurs the line between fact and fiction to underscore the importance of storytelling itself as a practice of endurance and resistance." A Los Angeles Times review opens, "The Book of Records is a reminder that human genius and the artistry of stunning prose are the antidote to AI's codswallop." And later, Thien translates complex topics into art, making the esoteric deeply resonant. Reading Thien is to admire how she brush strokes language to create beauty. Madeleine Thien will discuss her book with writer Jiayang Fan. As some of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Some of them are here with us looking glum because it's the last week of their fellowships here. Fellows receive an office in the center, access to our collections, and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and, of course, fiction writers at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write what we hope will be the enduring books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999. We're currently hosting our 26th annual class of fellows, and this series of conversations presents the books that they came here to write. After about 35 to 40 minutes of discussion, our presenters will move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. Staff members will pass along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about 30 minutes. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing Cullman Center, Cullman, at nypl.org. Copies of the Book of Records are for sale in the hall, and Maddie has agreed to sign them very generously. I forgot to ask her formally. She is joined this evening by Jiayang Fan, who has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2016. Her reporting on China, American politics, and culture has appeared in the magazine and on NewYorker.com since 2010. She's at work on her first book, Motherland, to be published by FSG in 2026. Madeleine Thien is the author of 3 novels and a collection of stories, and her work has been translated into 25 languages. Her most recent novel, Do Not Say We Have Nothing, won the Governor General's Award and was a finalist for the Booker Prize and the Women's Prize for Fiction. Her writings appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, the New York Review of Books, and elsewhere. She lives in Montreal. Please help me welcome Madeleine Thien and Jiayang Fan.
So the Book of Record is a book that I have been looking forward to reading ever since I ran into Maddie at a book event a few years ago. And in her typically unassuming way, she told me that she was working on a new novel that happened to feature 3 characters: Spinoza, Hannah Arendt, and the Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu. And honestly, I thought for a second that she must have been trolling me, because besides me, I wasn't sure how many other people spent their childhood memorizing the verses of Du Fu, grows up to be the most, to major in the least lucrative major there is, philosophy, with a particular interest in the question of free will, and then becomes a writer who reports on the culture and politics of an authoritarian regime. So it took me a moment to realize that Maddie was serious about this novel that she was writing. And I know that no writer likes to be hassled about their book, but I was so eager to read this novel, and I became so obsessed with kind of getting a hold of a copy that I would, I must admit, do cyber literary stalking, by which I mean that I would, I'm a podcast listener, so I would, like, plug her name in and wonder if she was doing any kind of interviews that would hint at when this book would be coming out, which is how I stumbled upon a conversation that you, Maddie, did with the writer Zadie Smith in when she was, I think, in Canada promoting her novel, The Fraud. So fast forward a few months ago, when I received the manuscript, which I devoured, and also an invitation to be in conversation with her here. And immense jubilation on my part was paired with trepidation, because having listened to Maddie's conversation with Zadie, I know exactly how meticulous a reader and thoughtful a question asker she is, which made me think, in an ideal world, Maddie, the masterful interviewer, would be up here asking Maddie, the masterful novelist, about her novel, which would really make me gratuitous. But alas, in the current space-time continuum that we occupy, that cannot be, and here we are. And I guess I want to start by saying, by just remarking on the fact that this is a book of staggering ambition, frightening intelligence, and deep humanity. And it was very much worth the wait, Maddie. It's also a genre-defying fable that seems to meld historical fiction with science fiction, with philosophy and math and physics and poetry. And I want to begin at the beginning, which is, where and how was the novel born? And when did Spinoza, Hannah Arendt, and Du Fu become the stars of your narrative constellation?
Thank you for all of that. And I just want to say, if I'm feeling trembly, there's something quite emotional for a Cullman Fellow to be back in this room. Having, as my fellow fellows will know, we all shed many tears in those offices as we struggle to bring to life these books that seem just beyond our grasp. And I will say, when Salvatore phoned me with the news that I'd been offered a fellowship, I started crying, and he told me they had a bucket just for tears. The beginning of this novel is very old in me. It was when my mom passed away suddenly in 2002. And I just remembered thinking, one day I'm going to write a novel set in a building made of time. But I had no idea what it meant. And Jiayang and I were talking about this just earlier, the loss of a parent and how we both turned to physics. And I was reading a lot of neurology. I was reading a lot about Einstein, because I had that question of, where did she go? But then, that idea just kind of stayed somewhere inside me. And then my father passed away a few years ago, and it suddenly came back into my head again. And I thought it was time to figure out what the building made of time looked like. And then with the other part of your question about how Hannah Arendt and Spinoza and Du Fu moved in, I had other figures that I had been reading for a long time, and I tried to prepare rooms for them in my building made of time, but those three are the ones who decided to unpack their suitcases, settle in, and start talking.
Yes, I wanted to ask about this. About this mysterious migrant compound that's called the Sea, and it's really a building of imagination and speculation. I mean, even those who are there don't quite know where they are, and I wanted to ask how the relationship of space and time figures into the construction of this building in your own imagination.
So a father and daughter wash into this enclave. It's called the Sea. This is the building made of time. And it turns out that most people will just arrive on a small boat, touch land, and set off again in the search for a safe home. The father and daughter can't leave for various reasons. Everyone who looks out of the windows of the enclave sees a different sea, a different body of water, a different time even. I had been thinking a lot about Einstein's ideas that time and space are the same. And I wanted to know how one could. He says that there is no such thing as time, absolute time. There is time as we experience it. If time and space are one, I wanted to ask what that could look like and feel like. And there's a beautiful line from the physicist Carlo Rovelli, who says, "A stone is a long event." And it's that all solid things are actually configurations of time, slow time, fast time, extended time. But all the solid things of our world are forces that have come together for a period of time and will dissolve.
Yes, I thought that. There's so many lines. Really, that are really poetic distillations of what time is in the book. That kind of took my breath away time and again in the novel. But in the very beginning, the girl who is 7 and her father who is quite sick, they're the characters we're introduced to at the beginning of the novel. She asks, I think quite reasonably, what ocean are we on? Sort of like, where are we? And the father asks, I thought a little tad impatiently, I already told you. The buildings of the sea are made of time. And then he takes a piece of string and folds it over through itself to form a double coin knot. I had it Google image that. And says, the string is time and the knot is space, but they're the same. The idea of space and time being the same, how does that then manifest itself in a book that has to be solid, that has to be written in words and made physical? Did that seem at all? Did that seem an impossible task?
Yes, I think that's why it took 9 years. Everything felt so fragile. I had this structure, but it did feel like if I walked down the wrong pathway of this structure, it would just crumble, collapse, crumple like a piece of paper would crumple. But I just had this feeling that out of this fragility, I could make something that could sustain many kinds of life.
well, because I've already admitted to being a literary stalker. I listened to this podcast that you did while you were writing the novel. I think like 5 years ago at this point. This podcast called First Draft. And I think I listened to it 3 times. Like by the third time, I basically knew some of the words that you were going to say. But I found it. Yes, I'm very much. I think I would make an excellent stalker of any variety. But you do. But you do say, because you're still, I think, trying to figure out the shape of the novel. You said. I think I'm 30 to, there's a 30 to 40% chance this novel might not come together. Mm-hmm. And I remember
I think it was was it more?
No, you said 30 to 40. I listened to the podcast 3 times.
That was one of the good days. That was one of the good days.
You definitely said 30 to 40. And, you gave me a lot of hope, because that's often how writing a book has felt like to me. And now and something about listening to it in the future. I think I listened to it in last year, and then twice again this year. And I thought I was, that I was a time traveler, because I knew that the book ultimately came together, but I also was observing your uncertainty, your description of that uncertainty, where it felt like 30 to 40%. It really felt like it could go one way or the other to me. And I wanted to ask, was it a moment or a scene? How did you know? How did that 40% ultimately become 80, 90, and 100?
Well, I will confess that after this incredible year at the Cullman, when I did many drafts and I wrote hundreds upon hundreds of pages and was surrounded by extraordinary books, that summer is when I thought I was going to throw the book away. The summer after the Cullman.
I thought I was going to go in a different direction.
I spent that summer, I think, weeping.
There was a bucket still, right?
Yeah, tears. Man, that bucket. I couldn't. It was like I'd written 5 different books, and I could have maybe pursued one to the end. But for me, the meaning lay in how they crossed and interlaced, and how they were in dialogue with each other, and how they illuminated each other. And that summer I sat down with my partner, who's a writer, and every morning we just talked about a piece of it, and I would go away and write. And he kind of helped me go back to the beginning and walk through a different path through the novel and rebuild it from scratch. And in that time, that summer, I threw away a lot, but I think I found the spine. And the spine really ended up being the girl and her father when they have to flee their country. The father randomly grabs 3 books off a shelf from a series called The Great Lives of Voyagers, and the 3 volumes he happens to take are Spinoza, Hannah Arendt, and Du Fu. And these become the only 3 books she has for the next 7 years. But when I found that that very real childlike thing that would hold the bigger pieces together, things started to click into place. Yeah.
This is a book where real figures from history, the 3 I mentioned, intersect with these 2 imaginary characters, fictional characters, the father and the young daughter. And I did wonder, you speak of the spine. How did you configure that intersection? And what brought you the most joy? Writing about these historical figures and setting scenes for them, or the father, the Chinese father and daughter, the daughter especially, who I won't spoil the novel, but who has, I think, many conflicted feelings about her father as she's growing. I mean, she's not with she has a brother and she has a mother and she's not with them. What came the fastest for you, writing about the historical characters or kind of this fictional landscape?
You know, it seems strange to say because they're so different and they come from such different times carrying different ideas. But they did come together. I got this image as you were talking about, like the paper cutouts we make as children, where they're like figures holding hands. It was that kind of like just barely connected, and yet they are echoes of each other. And I think the heart of it is that they've had to flee both political and environmental catastrophe. The father has a lot on his conscience. She has lost her mother and her brother and her aunt. What her father wants to tell her about what it is to live an ethical life in a collapsing world, he wants to give her something to take into the future, but he knows he's not the model for what he wants to tell her. So the stories become ways to both think about some of the deepest ethical questions and to think about survival, but also to the thing is, all of those characters, as their stories emerge, they facets of themselves that I couldn't see before became visible.
I love that. I love the way that the characters in the novel, they're groping toward an understanding that has to come sort of piece by piece, but then envelops them at some point. And I felt that in I felt that in your description of how the novel has come together, because again, I've listened to interviews of you talking about this novel, but I also thought about how it mirrors the building that we talked about earlier, the sea, that it doesn't stand there forever, right? It also itself has to dissolve, and I wondered in the writing. You said it took 9 years. I mean, how many drafts did it take? I mean, how many moments of dissolution did the novel itself have to experience in order to become the book of records?
One tries not to think about it. But I suspect it's a bit like painting. You have this huge canvas, you do this detail where you sketch things in, you step back, you think about it, you paint over, you try again. When you get some part clear that illuminates something over here, and the blank spaces start to fill in, it kind of generates, or at least when I'm happiest writing is when I can see it generating something I could never have envisioned. I wanted to make, yes, there's complexity of ideas in this novel, but in a way I wanted to find the simplest thread that could weave through, because part of the longing I was grappling with was that this deep hunger for an education that the girl has, Lena. She only has these 3 books. Mm-hmm. She's carrying so much. Mm-hmm. She longs to understand some of the deepest questions that, as all children do. Mm-hmm. And in the search for that education, she opens up herself to so many kinds of ideas, and she gives ideas refuge in herself.
I mean, I love that. I'm paging through one of my favorite books, Invisible Cities. Calvino is thank you. Is mentioned. Calvino is mentioned in the novel, and I was sort of astonished to discover the way in which sort of Maddie's book has, in a way, lived inside me, because the way that she constructs it and the ideas she's exploring are ideas that have been swirling inside me for so long. And I was flipping through the book. When you've dog-eared too many pages, you end up not really finding the one that you're looking for. But this line that really stayed with me, I think Marco Polo, a character in Invisible Cities, is talking about sort of what makes a bridge, and he's talking to about sort of, what exactly is a bridge? Is it one stone? Is it kind of all the stones? I mean, where does the bridge exist? Because it doesn't exist. It can't exist in any one of the stones, right? And Polo says, the bridge is not supported by one stone or another, but by the line of arch they form. And I thought of that in relation to the way that the young girl is groping toward an understanding, like you said, but also of the Book of Records, right? The Book of Records is a book in the novel that keeps getting updated by travelers, and it's not any one single page, it's not any one single person's additions or annotations. And I wanted to ask you kind of, what you make of the Book of Records. What does it mean kind of in the context of this novel?
I suspect that one of the things the novel is grappling with, because there's stories within stories in this book, and there's historical figures and the real and the imagined. And a lot of it is about what it means to inherit a history, how histories come down to us, how we retell them, how we misunderstand them, how we put them to use, and then maybe how we inherit some that were never intended for us. And I think the Book of Records in this case is both that thing that's passed from hand to hand, that thing that you tell another person because you hope that a parent might tell their child because they hope it will help that child live their life or give them wonder. Could be a false thing, but they hope through that false thing to put their finger on a true thing. I think that prismatic idea of how we keep the record keeps getting turned over in this novel. And I think there's a lot of desire to think about our obligation to keep a record, especially in the most catastrophic times.
This leads beautifully to my next question, which again takes root in words you've said about kind of how and why you became a writer. You said that in your earlier books, it wasn't even about you as so much as trying to give voice to your parents' inner lives, and that you were trying to express things that maybe they could not express to you, or perhaps even to themselves. And I felt such an intimacy with you with that very feeling that made me want to be a writer. But I also feel sometimes my own incapacity to do so. I feel overwhelmed by the duty of representing them truthfully, and not knowing, and actually knowing that they will never be there, that they cannot be there to verify if I have done them justice on the page. And I thought about the Book of Records, what it means in relation to my own feelings of guilt and incapacity, and I wondered how that strikes you in writing, whether you still feel like you're giving voice to your parents, or even to others who are not here to tell their stories.
I think I would never be so bold, actually. I think I could never actually give voice. But I think there's something about our parents that is always mysterious. Partly because we only arrived when they're quite deep into their lives. Mm-hmm. Partly because they don't confide in us sometimes. And partly I think maybe sometimes they're trying to set you on a path that's quite different from their own. I would say that, when I was younger, I wanted to understand my father very deeply. He was very traumatized by the Second World War. His father had been executed in the closing days of the Second World War. His town had been bombed out of existence. He had attempted suicide at different times when I was young. But part of writing fiction is the acceptance of the mystery of the other, but also the attentiveness that we give to those we love, not to explain them, but just to be with them. And I think writing fiction for me, I kind of accepted from the beginning I would never capture them because they were much more complex than anything I could put to paper. And I think the inner life of all the books, of all the 4 or 5 books has been to find facets of my parents in others through the telling of many other kinds of lives. I've written about the Cambodian genocide, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen demonstrations. Now, Hannah Arendt trying to find a safe refuge from Germany and France out of Nazi-occupied France. Du Fu facing a civil war that is going to bring down the Tang Dynasty ultimately. Spinoza excommunicated for his beliefs, having to, but yet believing that there is some rare and precious truth that is available to all people. To paraphrase the Brecht poem, those who ask questions deserve answers. I know I'm kind of escaping your question in a bit, but it is, I think, so much that became clear to me in the writing of this book was the way Lena is never, she comes to believe she's not going to find the answers she's looking for. And what she does is recognize the people she's lost and the people she loves in the faces of strangers.
Yes, in her search, I realized that in many ways she's trying to go home, like many of the characters in this novel, and it really made me think about the notion of home, because after my mother died about 4 years ago, I felt a grief so intense that I thought I was standing outside of time. And that feeling of standing outside of time made me, Maddie and I were just discussing this, for a year or two, I felt utterly paralyzed. I was not writing my book, which is 4 years and counting late. But I did, Maddie's probably the only person in the world who understands this. I didn't, people recommended going to church, adopting a dog, dating. I actually dove so deeply into quantum physics and Einstein, and it was my attempt to stay alive, which we were just talking about this, right before the event, which friends of mine, they accepted, but they accept that I am an odd person. But I think Maddie might be the only person who understands that I was fighting for my life, trying to understand this relationship between time and space, where my mother had gone, and if I could ever make sense of the universe enough to go on in time. Going back to this question of home, I felt really homeless in my own body when my mom died. Like, I felt deeply homeless kind of in my flesh. And I was wondering if you could talk about sort of what home means for, there's a convergence of these various characters who also, I think, feel quite homeless, and this feeling of never being able to go home, which is quite honestly how I felt. What did you think about home in the context of this novel, and whether Lena, the young Chinese girl with the ailing father, or how Spinoza, Dufu, Hannah Arendt, kind of their conception of home, how do they all converge in this novel?
Yes. They all are made to feel that they have no home by the political situation, by various things that happen, by war, by alienation. It is what Hannah Arendt talks about rootlessness, isolation, loneliness as the conditions that are in place as totalitarianism enters a political realm. What I think I learned from them, and that, in the context of the book, they try to tell Lena, the girl, is very much that they understand themselves to be part of something larger than themselves. Hannah Arendt, I think in particular, talks about understanding that what is happening to a collective, that her individual experience is not something that's happening just to her, and that in fact this gives her a kind of strength to face the terror that makes her flee to look for safety. She's very much about thinking of herself as an exception, the exception that will be saved. She understands that to be saved and to find home is something that requires all. And I think this is the lesson, or the thing they're trying to convey to this young girl who has lost her home and possibly will never. The place that she wants to return to no longer exists. in the end, I think these characters, these historical figures, the real and the imagined, they see our relation to one another as the homeland, not a piece of ground, not a country, not even an identity. The place of home is what I mean to you and you mean to me, what I'm able to see of you and you of me. That's the space we're making, that's the collective space, and that is, I think Hannah Arendt would say, this world which is so hard to love, which is so cruel, is our only home ultimately, and we are responsible for it. I think, and these are not things that ideas I would have come to on my own. They come through the work of the fictional imagination to place ideas together and see what emerges.
Thank you so much. I was so, awestruck by, again, the coming together of these three characters who live in such different times and with under such different conditions and constraining realities. But especially, I was interested in Du Fu because Spinoza and Hannah Arendt, in my American classrooms, I mean, these are figures that, especially if you're a philosophy major, you're likely to encounter. But Du Fu exists for me in different language. It exists for me in almost like nursery rhymes. I mean, those were the verses that I grew up on. And my last question to you is about how he fits in when his words have to cross the barrier of language. Almost everyone who cannot read Chinese do not get to experience the fullness of his verse. Was that complicated for you to thread him in? And again, I'm sure there are more, other Chinese Americans like me, but I don't encounter very many people who's kind of as obsessed with, Spinoza and his, thoughts on determinism, but also feel so bathed in the verses of Du Fu. How did you, especially as you're writing English, how were you able to navigate that difference in language, but also I think more profoundly in a different culture and universe of thinking?
Yes. Well, you might be surprised to know that I cannot read Du Fu in Chinese. So I only read Du Fu in translation. And I think the beauty of a figure like Du Fu is and so many of the Tang poets, is how many people have tried to translate them. So when you read them in English, in fact, you get this prismatic experience because the translations are so different and they so much reflect what the translator is trying to distill from these extraordinary works. So yes, I can read a little bit of it, but there's no way that I would have the understanding that you would have simply directly into the Chinese language. But it kind of felt right to me because in some ways even the way the whole novel handles history is about these refractions, these prismatic relationships, these ways, both in terms of how ideas come to us across time, but also how we return to them in the course of our own life and how that creates its own refractive quality. And I would also say that between the three thinkers, because I'm writing about them at certain turning points of their lives that are not well documented in their works, which gave me a lot of creative freedom. But I was looking for how the world gave rise to the ideas that we know them for. I was really much as interested in the worlds as the figures, the sense that we become the vehicles or we become the vessels for what the world brings to us. And in that vein, I took there was a certain joy both in the transgression, because I wanted these three, renowned figures to be on an equal level with this 14-year-old girl. And I wanted to claim that equality for her. Equality before the face of these questions that face us all. And I also took a great pleasure in redistributing some of their ideas amongst each other. So a Du Fu poem will show up in Hannah Arendt's typewriter. Hannah Arendt's father will tell her a story about free will, but it's really from a letter Spinoza wrote to someone else. And this is the air we breathe. This is the air of ideas, in which,
there's some wonderful questions here. I'm going to start with one that I would also like to know the answer to, which is, other than Calvino, are there other novels that served as models for this book? Were there inspiration? Were there books that were echoing in your head as you were writing this? That kind of structurally kind of gave you a sense of what might work.
One of them that was very important to me were the works of the Japanese writer Yoko Ogawa, particularly The Memory Police, in which things disappear from the world. And when they disappear, one day, say, all the roses will disappear. They'll just fall to the ground and then flow down the river and be gone. And when the roses are gone, the word for rose disappears. And when the word for rose disappears, the memories that people have that have to do with roses disappear. And she does it with such a light touch. And that's what I wanted. I wanted that sense of this, my favorite novels are the ones that are like, it should not work. It should not work. And yet, it works. And you could have this fragile thing that can hold not just me, the writer, but many different kinds of readers. And for sure, Calvino does this. Yes.
That's related to this next question, which is, given the abstract idea at the root of the sea, this way station, how did you develop a visual language to describe it? Were there real places or landscapes that, influenced the construction in your mind of the sea?
Yes. Kowloon Walled City, which used to exist in Hong Kong. Do you know Kowloon Walled City?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it was an enclave. It actually was an old Chinese military outpost, I believe in the 16th century. And then it's vast. It's vast. It was a parcel of land that when the British took control of Hong Kong was not ceded to the British and was still under Chinese administrative control, but with no access for China to reach it. So it became a no man's land. And people without papers, people who needed to disappear, people who couldn't afford to live anywhere else, refugees, they took shelter in this piece of land and started to build as necessity required. And so there was no architectural plan. People just built when they needed an extra room, an extra floor, a place to bake bread, a school, all kinds of things. And then in the end, there were 300 buildings that kind of crossed through each other. And it's been since been demolished after Hong Kong was handed back to China. But for, I think, as many as 60,000 people, it was a universe within a universe, a home, a dangerous place, lawless, anarchic, and yet self-regulating. And there's some beautiful illustrations and photographs of Kowloon Walled City, and I would sometimes just look at these for hours, thinking about what it means to build this kind of refuge collectively.
I love that. I also I loved hearing. I mean, you say, in a different interview that whether the novel worked or not, I get like kind of the hours you spent looking at these pictures. You said that you had spent 8 months immersed in the verses, in the poems of Du Fu, and you said, it doesn't matter whether the novel works. I mean, just to have been able to spend 8 months, that's enough. And I wondered if how did you determine, whether you were how much research to do? Because I can tell how much you love, really getting inside, reading the verses and the books of these various writers, and going to Lisbon and various other places that your characters were set. Sorry, I'm sneaking in a question here, but how did you determine enough that that you had done enough research that this was then the time to write, or was it always kind of a little bit unknowable even to yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I would say that summer when I was thinking I would throw the book away. My partner, my beloved, said to me, "Your problem is that you love them too much." And it never felt like research because they felt like people I was living with. And when you love someone, they're friends, you could sit and listen to them for hours. You feel the privilege of their company. And it never felt like research with a purpose. I never wanted to instrumentalize them. I wanted to live with them. I wanted just to be open to what they could tell me.
Yes, I think I suffer from the same condition, in which
excessive love,
or where I feel sometimes, like many of the characters in the novel, so disconnected, alienated by the current world we live in. So, it's only when I'm reading Virginia Woolf that I feel like I find someone who, long dead, but understands something about me that makes us friends, oddly, in a way that kind of makes me question my own sanity sometimes, but also feels so much of this book, which is about these characters living in disparate times, different eras, and geographies, who also they become friends in this book, in the sea, and that connection between them makes me feel like I might not be completely mad for believing that in some ways I could be friends with Virginia Woolf. Sorry, that's a side note. But going back, here's a question that's not unrelated to what I just said. In a book that departs so much from our common sense of consecutive time, how did you negotiate the problem that the reader will read it in order, consecutively, beginning on page 1 and proceeding stepwise toward the end.
Oh, interesting. Is someone planning to jump around in the book? Sequential things, so interesting. For me, the book is a voyage, and it can only unfold in the sequence of the rooms that we encounter, because each provides the opening to the next passage. So for me, I didn't think there would be any problem. I thought I really did believe that it is the repository within us, the sea, the way memory flows and intercuts and leaps. To be honest, the structure came together. While I was writing the book, my father passed away and my best friend passed away, and I had the terrible sorrow, but the privilege of being with them in the last weeks of their lives and to the end. And I do remember thinking about, as they were coming into and out of consciousness, the way they would hear different conversations, the way as they came into consciousness, they were moving through time, leaping like this through different doorways. But there's a unity, which perhaps is their soul. And so maybe I trusted that innately the reader will understand what it means to have time wash into them.
Well, that's an excellent point to stop. Thank you, Maddie, for allowing me to travel alongside you and through myself in this splendid novel. And thank you so much for all of you for coming to hear this conversation that I feel I'm not very good with sequential time or with sequential questions, if you can't tell already. Thank you for being alongside this hopscotching journey with us. And Maddie will be around to sign books. I really recommend you hopping on this voyage of the book. It's a very worthy and wondrous one. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.